In order for us to write an equation of a trigonometric function, we need to first identify the amplitude, midline, and the period. So the first thing that I'm going to do here is I'm going to calculate the midline. So the midline is the value that is halfway between your maximum point and your minimum point. So here we have a maximum point at 8 and a minimum point at -4. So the difference between those two, divided by 2, that gives me a midline of 2. Okay, so here we can see that the midline is at y equals 2. Now let's calculate the amplitude. So the amplitude is the distance between your maximum point. So it's the distance between the maximum point and the midline. That's your amplitude. Or it's the distance between your minimum point and your midline. So those distances should be the same. So if I take my maximum point of 8 and I subtract it from the midline of 2, that gives me an amplitude of 6. Okay, the next thing that we need to calculate is we need to calculate the period. So the period is how long it takes along the x-axis here. So how many units to complete either one full rotation of sine or one full rotation of cosine. And it can be positive sine or negative sine, positive cosine or negative cosine. So I'm going to use a different color here. I'm going to use orange, and I'm going to highlight one full rotation of negative sine. So you can see here that negative sine, we get one full rotation from t equals 0 to t equals 20. So that tells me that the period is 20, okay? Now, if you are looking at, so that was a negative sine function. If you are looking at positive sine, let me use a different color here. So let me see if I can find a different color highlighter. I'll use hot pink, okay? Then positive sine, you'll see that positive sine starts at when x is 10. So when x is 10, this is one full rotation of positive sine. So one full rotation of positive sine goes from 10 to 30. So if you subtract 30 minus 10, notice the period is still 20. If you are looking at a positive cosine function, so again, I'll pick a different color, I'll use green. So positive cosine, it always starts at a maximum value. So here, if we take a look at positive cosine, one full rotation of positive cosine starts at x equals 15 and ends at x equals 35. So if I subtract 35 minus 15, that difference is also 20. So notice the period is still 20. So in order for you to calculate the period, you just want to take a look at how long it takes. So how long means how many units on the x-axis it takes to make one full rotation of either positive sine or negative sine or positive cosine or negative cosine. Okay, so now that we have that cleared up, we need to ask ourselves a few more questions here. So once you have the period, you got to calculate that coefficient, k. So k is always 2 pi over the period. So here, if our period is 20, 2 pi over 10, right? Our k value is going to be pi over, oh, excuse me, I made a mistake here. So that's 2 over 20, not 2 pi over 20, not 2 pi over 10. So 2 pi over 20, which simplifies to pi over 10. Okay, now that we have that value, all right, to write a sine function. So if you're going to write a positive sine function, you have to see where positive sine is on this blue curve. So here, if you guys recall earlier, I highlighted positive cosine in pink. So I'm going to do it again. Positive cosine starts at when x is 10. And we see that we get one full rotation of positive sine, but there's some shifting there. So sine with no shifting, so positive sine with no shifting would start at the midline when x is 0. But here we can see that our x values shifted over 10 units. And when we write it in the equation, it's actually going to be 10 units to the left. So putting all the pieces together, if I write a positive sine function, so I'll put the positive sign here, we're going to have a horizontal shift, so horizontal shift of 10 units left. Okay, all right, so let's write the equation. Let's put everything together. So that gives me 6. The amplitude is 6. I'm using positive sine. I need my k value, pi over 10 times x minus, right, 10 units plus my midline, 2. Okay, so this is one equation that you can write that is a sine function. Okay, let's write one for positive cosine. So for positive cosine, I'll use my green highlighter again. Notice that positive cosine starts at x equals 15. So that means that the horizontal shift for a positive cosine function, right, shifts all my x values 15 units left. Okay, so I'm writing 15 units left because that's how we write it in the equation, but obviously in the graph here we see that it takes our positive cosine function with no shifting and shifts everything 15 units to the right. Okay, so let's go ahead and write that equation. Y is equal to positive 6 cosine pi over 10 x minus 15 plus 2. Okay, so that is another equation that you can write for this function. Now, while we're on this topic, let's talk about what a negative sine and negative cosine function would look like. So if you want to write a negative sine function, right, let me bring back that orange highlighter. And I know that there's a lot of colors on the screen right now, but negative sine, right, there's no shifting. So it starts at x equals 0, right? We hit the midline. So to write the equation here, we would say y is equal to negative, so the amplitude still stays the same. So for negative sine function, pi over 10, and you can write it as x minus 0, or you can just simply write it as x, right? Because we know we don't need to write minus 0, but I'm just putting it there so you can see there's no shifting horizontally, and then add the midline, okay? All right, now let's talk about what a negative cosine function would look like. So let me use a different color that I haven't used yet. So let me see what highlighter colors I have left. Let me use, let's see, let me use purple. Let's see if that shows up, okay? All right, so if you follow along here, negative cosine, so negative cosine here starts at x equals 5, and we can see that's one full rotation. So one full rotation of negative cosine. All right, and so that takes all of my x units, shifts it 5 units to the left. I know on the graph it looks like it's moving it to the right, but in the equation we always write the minus sign to indicate that it's to the left. And so the negative cosine function would be negative 6 cosine pi over 10 x minus 5 plus 2, okay? So you can either write a positive or a negative sine or cosine function, and you can see that if you actually put all 4 of these equations into your calculator, it will graph the same function.